critics of Coleridge's time, William Hazlitt took a rather dim view of Kubla Khan. Writing in the Examiner on June 2nd, 1816, he said, "The poem only shows that Mr. Coleridge can write better nonsense verses than any man in England," adding, "It is not a poem, but a musical composition." Citing the opening lines of the third stanza as an example, he says, "We could repeat these lines to ourselves not the less often for not knowing the meaning of them." And that, perhaps, is the point. Whatever Kubla Khan means, if it means anything at all, it sounds great. So, let's begin by looking at the way the poet uses sound. The opening line, borrowed from Purchas's Pilgrims, gains an extra syllable, turning Zamdu to Xanadu to create an iambic tetrameter. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan, did-dum, 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 did-dum. And there's an intricate balance of sounds in this line, giving it a wonderful resonance. This is perhaps best illustrated by picking out the vowel sounds. I, a, u, a, a. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan. Zan is balanced by Khan, and the alliterative d and k sounds, the assonance of I in and did, and a and u in Xanadu and Kubla Khan, all work together to create a powerful effect. An effect that continues into the second line as Coleridge inverts the verb-object word order of his source text, substituting pleasure dome for palace and decree for build, once again creating a powerful iambic tetrameter. A stately pleasure dome decree. The alliterative d sound punctuates the final iamb, picking up on the second iamb of the first line, and we've got little echoes going on with Kubla and pleasure and stately and decree. And that's just the first two lines. I won't be going into the whole poem in such detail, but it should be clear that with so much going on in terms of rhyme, rhythm, assonance and alliteration, it's not surprising the end result is something of a feast for the ear. In the third line, Alf, the sacred river, picks up on the a sounds of Xanadu and Kubla Khan, and the rhyme with ran reinforces Khan in the first line. I'm not certain whether Khan and ran would have been pronounced with R and A respectively in Coleridge's day, but I don't think it matters much, especially since ran is an exact rhyme with man in the following line, giving a strong sense of structure and flow to the third and fourth lines, reinforcing the flow of the river itself. The opening sentence of the poem resolves with a shorter line, a trimeter rather than a tetrameter, down to a sunless sea, or perhaps better with an inverted first foot, down to a sunless sea. Just as the river itself comes to an end, brought up short by the sunless sea. Again, Coleridge depends heavily on alliteration in these three lines. River ran, enhancing the sense of the river flowing, measureless to man, conveying a sense of the immensity of the caverns, and culminating in the sibilant S sounds of the sunless sea into which the river flows. The fact that the caverns are measureless while the sea is sunless creates an image of something both huge and hidden, and it is perhaps at this point that we should start trying to address the $64 question. What does it all mean? It's pretty amazing, really, that one of the most famous poems in the English language doesn't really seem to mean anything at all. I don't mean by that that it doesn't contain images, pictures we can visualize, just that there doesn't seem to be any thought content, any ideas or concepts underpinning the imagery and driving the poem forward. This, I think, is what Hazlitt and other critics of Coleridge's time found puzzling, frustrating even. There is, as we shall see, a kind of thought process that comes to light in the final lines of the poem, but it's so slight and tenuous that it leaves us grasping frantically for some clue as to what we should make of it. We're going to need to read the poem right through before we can really get to grips with what it might mean, but we can at least pick out some of the elements in these opening lines and think about them. If you've been watching my poetry videos, you'll know I'm very big on noticing contrasting elements within a poem, and that's where I'd like to start with these opening lines. The first images Coleridge gives us are a stately pleasure dome and a sacred river, followed by caverns measureless to man and a sunless sea. Domes are man-made and rise up to the sky, while caverns are natural and underground. The third line, which tells us of the river running through Xanadu, doesn't explicitly mention open countryside beneath the sky, but that surely is how we envisage it, until we're told it runs through caverns to a sunless sea. So there seems to be some kind of contrast being set up here between the man-made artifice of the pleasure dome, which rises up, and the downward flow of the river towards the caverns and the sunless sea. The pleasure dome, being man-made, must have its dimensions, although again this is not stated explicitly, but the caverns are measureless to man, and that sense of vastness is associated with darkness as the river runs through these measureless caverns to a sea that is sunless. It's too early to say what that might add up to, or what it might all mean, but it's worth bearing in mind these contrasting elements to see whether they build up into some kind of pattern as we read further into the poem. In the 6th and 7th lines of the poem, Coleridge reverts to the iambic tetrameter, and the rhyme follows the same pattern as lines 2 and 3. And then, much as he used a shorter line to convey the sense of the river coming to an abrupt end as it flowed into the sunless sea, he now lengthens the lines into pentameters to convey a sense of luxuriance, compounded by the sense of fullness created by the sesquisyllabic diphthongs of sinuous and menian, which seem to overfill the lines with an extra half syllable. The rhymes, rills, hills, tree and greenery, all fall on words denoting the world of nature, and words like bright, blossomed and sunny help to create an atmosphere of richness and abundance, anticipated by that word fertile. This all seems far away from the caverns measureless to man in the preceding sentence, but there's still a curious tension going on here. The walls, the towers, the gardens, these are, like the pleasure dome itself, man-made. But alongside them there are ancient forests, implicitly dark, enfolding, as they do, the spots of greenery. Once again, these lines contain an unresolved tension between the man-made, light-filled, walled gardens and the dark forests of the natural world, which somehow seem to occupy the same space, with water, the sinuous rills, acting as a kind of conduit between the two. Modern analysis of the Romantic poets very often dwells on socio-political aspects of their work, and Kubla Khan has come in for its share of attention in that area. A. Voss, in a paper published in 1989, sees in the walls built round the fertile ground of Xanadu the social practice that draws the poem back from dreams of 13th century Asia to the reality of England in the last decade of the 18th century. And he's talking, of course, about the Enclosure Acts, a series of laws which privatised the common land, placing it in the hands of the wealthy and abolishing the open field system of agriculture. And so forcing people out of agriculture and the countryside and into the cities to stoke the engines of the Industrial Revolution. Well, maybe. Coleridge does actually use the word enclosed in the preface to the poem, and the whole issue of enclosures was very much in the forefront of the Romantic consciousness, as indeed of late 18th and early 19th century society as a whole. And the image of a tyrant appropriating fertile land and turning it into a pleasure dome certainly resonates with the privatisation of the common land that was going on in Coleridge's time. But I would hesitate to say that this is what the poem is about in any meaningful sense. So far, though, apart from some striking exotic imagery, we don't have any real clue as to what the poem actually is about. In this section of the poem, Coleridge describes yet another feature of the landscape of Xanadu, a deep romantic chasm, a place at once savage, holy and enchanted. Savage here may mean sylvan or wooded, rather than what we generally understand by the word today. Milton, in Paradise Lost, uses the word savage in a similar way, and in a context that, as I.A. Richards noted, has close links with this section of Coleridge's poem. Richards notes that the description of Eden in Book 4 of Paradise Lost contains a section providing the actual sources of not a few of the images and phrases of Kubla Khan. The river passing through Eden, its rills watering the garden, and so on, are all echoed in Coleridge's poem. And, as Thomas Copeland noted, Milton's description of Eden is preceded by a reference to Asmodeus, the demon lover in Tobit, an apocryphal book of the Bible. Now, this is the kind of intertextuality that raises doubts about Coleridge's description of the circumstances in which the poem came to be written. We know that Coleridge was familiar with Milton, and we even know that around the time that he wrote Kubla Khan, he made an entry in his notebook indicating his interest in the Book of Tobit. Clearly, Paradise Lost and the Book of Tobit were in Coleridge's mind when he wrote Kubla Khan. Did they just spontaneously spill from his unconscious mind into the poem, as he claims? Or is the text a much more consciously contrived piece of work than he lets on? I don't suppose there'll ever be a satisfactory answer to that question. What is clear, though, is that Coleridge has drawn on these and other sources to create something new. There's no waning moon in Milton or Tobit, and the woman, rather than being filled with fear by the demon, is wailing for him, apparently with desire. And, weirdly, the woman isn't even there. She's just described to get across the idea that the chasm in Xanadu is the sort of place where one might see a woman wailing for a demon lover. Whoever or whatever she is, we are no closer to understanding what, apart from its vivid and fantastic imagery, the poem is trying to express. Again, one is tempted to say, well, whatever it means, at least it sounds good, with those alliterated W sounds in waning and was and woman and wailing. Evocative and atmospheric as these lines are, though, we're still no closer to an understanding of what the poem is or might be about. The images pile up one on top of the other, but where is it all going? What is it all leading to? Having painted the scene of a deep romantic chasm, the kind of place where a woman might well wail for her demon lover, Coleridge now describes the sacred river bursting forth from the chasm with tremendous pulsating energy. If you want to see something orgasmic in this description, go ahead. Those fast, thick pants may or may not be intended to carry erotic overtones, but the image of the earth forcing a mighty fountain out of itself can certainly be interpreted in that way. We can also see these lines as an evocation of the process of giving birth, a constant outpouring of creative energy. There's not enough here to come to a firm conclusion yet, but there's a hint that perhaps it is this, the creative process itself, that Coleridge is concerned with in this poem. For now, let's just add that thought to what we've already noticed about the contrast between the light and airy pleasure dome, a man-made creation with measurable dimensions that rises upwards, and the caverns measureless to man with their sunless sea into which the sacred river flows. Is the river perhaps some kind of conduit between these two opposing features of the landscape of Xanadu? And is that landscape itself a kind of mapping of the poet's mind in the very moment of creative inspiration? That's the kind of approach that critics like Dorothy Mercer and Irene Hayes were suggesting in the 1950s and 60s, and it's certainly worth considering. Perhaps, as Warren Stevenson suggests in a paper published in 1973, Kubla Khan's act of decreeing a pleasure dome symbolically unites the idea of God creating the world and the artist or poet creating works of the imagination. Again, these lines are finely crafted. There's plenty of alliteration, ceaseless and seething, miles, meandering, mazy and motion, and so on, all adding to the rich texture of the poem. The rhythm is a basic iambic pentameter. The rhymes are mostly in a regular A-A-B-B-C-C kind of pattern, with half rhymes and occasional variations, notably the A-B-B-A rhyme of lines 25 to 28, which reinforces the sense of the river meandering, and the switch to tetrameter with the two-syllable rhymes pleasure and measure, before reverting to the basic pattern of the stanza in the final couplet. Those variations in the rhyme and rhythm coincide with the repetition of imagery from earlier on in the poem. The pleasure dome itself, the measureless caverns, while lines 29 and 30 and 35 to 36 carry the poem forward with new information, the ancestral voices prophesying war, and the sharpening of the contrast between the pleasure dome and the caves with the words sunny and ice. As ever, these technical features of the poem seem so finely wrought that I find myself doubting Coleridge's version of how the poem came to be written. How can such well-crafted work simply happen? If there's anything that makes me think that maybe it was a spontaneous creative outpouring, much as the river itself bursts forth from the earth in these lines, and that he was interrupted before he could complete it, it's those lines about Kubla Khan hearing ancestral voices prophesying war. Those lines seem ripe for further development. They carry a hint, perhaps, that art, pleasure, creativity have their counterparts in conflict and destruction, that even a magnificent artifice such as the pleasure dome may be destroyed, but the point is not developed. If there's any aspect of the poem that tends to confirm Coleridge's claim that the poem is incomplete, I feel that this is it. So far I've picked up on one or two hints that the poem may be about itself, in the sense that it's a poetic creation on the theme of poetic creativity. But it's not until we get to this final section of the poem that this idea finds its full expression. The artfully alliterative damsel with a dulcimer is, in effect, Coleridge's muse, the source of his poetic inspiration. If he could just bring her song to life inside him, he would be able to build that dome in air. R.H. Vogel, in a paper published in 1951, puts forward the idea that Kubla Khan is essentially about the reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities through the imagination. The damsel with the dulcimer, of course, is herself part of this balancing of opposite or discordant qualities, being, as Warren Stevenson expresses it, the redemptive counterpart to the woman wailing beneath a waning moon for her demon lover. At the broadest level, Kubla Khan can be seen as a poem about the opposition of heaven and hell, with Kubla Khan himself in the role of God the Creator, and the poet in turn seeking to take on that role and build that dome in air with its archetypal dichotomy of sunny dome and caves of ice. This idea that the poem is a symbolic representation of the act of artistic and divine creation involving the fusion of opposites makes a lot of sense to me. The only thing we might want to add here is that Coleridge expresses the failure to achieve any such reconciliation. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, he says, essentially making the point that he can't. Coleridge then ends by saying what would happen if he could. He would build the sunny dome and caves of ice with music loud and long, and all who heard should see them. But here again, just as the poem seems to resolve itself in a clear conclusion, the words slip through our fingers, as it were, leaving us with more questions than answers. Elizabeth Schneider, writing in 1945, noted the parallels with the description of poetic inspiration in Plato's Aeon, but as James Bramwell pointed out a few years later, the positive elements are undercut by the fact that if he could build the dome and the caves in such a way that others could hear his music and see them, they would not rejoice, but cry, beware. As Bramwell puts it, Coleridge is under an evil spell, a poet intoxicated rather than inspired, and a paradise so gained is only a fool's paradise. The jury's still out on this. Michael Rager, for example, in a paper published in 2013, challenges conventional readings of Coleridge's Kubla Khan that interpret the poem as presenting an ideal model of poetic creativity. And the debate on this issue underscores an even more fundamental question. Has Coleridge delivered the goods here? Can we say, as Anita O'Donnell does, that in a poem concerned with the loss of creative inspiration, the paradox is that through that loss, Coleridge has created, for Kubla Khan has been written? Or should we conclude, as Molly Lefebvre does, that this final section of the poem is a total non sequitur, a small masterpiece of confidence trickery? That's something you'll have to work out for yourself. I hope this video has given you some basic insights into what is or may be going on here. The rest is up to you.